In 2007, after getting rejected by every major UK publisher, Jonathan Black's book, The Secret History of the World, became an international bestseller. The public had resonated with an idea that the publishers had not. That behind mainstream cultural histories, stories of kings, wars and empires, runs a hidden history, a countercultural history if you like, preserved in the esoteric traditions of ancient Greece, Egypt, Judaism, Christianity, Islam and the Renaissance. Jonathan had suggested that many pivotal cultural developments were shaped by ideas transmitted through initiatory schools rather than mainstream institutions, and that myths and sacred texts encoded philosophical and psychological truths rather than supernatural claims. His theme is that humanity's evolution is driven by insights into consciousness, symbolism, and the hidden structures of reality. Well, now, almost 20 years later, he's released another book, The Secret History of the Universe, an ambitious title, in which he argues that 20th and 21st century physics has gradually moved away from the materialism of the 19th century, and often, perhaps unintentionally, towards ideas that resemble the world's ancient mystical traditions. That many of the discipline's greatest figures, Einstein, Niels Bohr, Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Oppenheimer and others, were motivated by philosophical, sometimes mystical questions about consciousness, reality and humanity's place in the cosmos. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen, or am I? I started to question a lot of things after my conversation with Jonathan Black, or Mark Booth as his mum knows him. I had my melon properly twisted, my mind bent, my consciousness expanded somewhat. But before we get into all that, thanks to all those who listen to the Bureau. I really appreciate the feedback people have been sending. There's so much good stuff to listen to, isn't there, these days? Only marred, I think, by the constant interruption of the man trying to get us to buy shit we never knew we needed. As you know, it's my aim to keep this place sacred, if not secret, and that includes not taking the advertiser's filthy lucre. So we'll be grateful if you help support us via our Patreon, but you can join for free and just send us love if times are too tight. bureauoflostculture.com. Right, back to today. I think Jonathan Black, Mark Booth's work is extraordinary. It's opened me up to a new way of thinking and also kind of made sense of certain things. There's something very positive and life-affirming about it in a very human way. We talked about consciousness, about relativity, about quantum physics, about prayer, magic, ideas as entities, and all sorts of other things. Let's dive right in. The waters are deep. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, Jonathan Black or Mark Booth. And which is it, and why would you have two names?
Thank you for inviting me on your wonderful show. My real name is Mark Booth, and when I wrote my first book, The Secret History of the World, and I got an agent and he was about to circulate it among London publishers, a lot of them knew me because I worked as a publisher and editor, and I was worried that they would think it was rubbish. They would think I was completely mad and shouldn't be in my job. And it was turned down by all the publishers in London. It only got published when a new publishing company started up. That book only very narrowly squeezed through from the realm of ideas into the kind of consensus world. I think that's important to say because I think a lot of people in publishing are they're very complacent, and they'll say things like, well, any book that's good enough will get discovered and published. I see no reason to believe that.
We want to believe that, don't we? It's a bit like if you're a musician, you want to believe that if your music's good enough that somebody's going to pick it up, but it's never really just been about that. So I'm going to call you Mark for the purposes of this. It must have been quite satisfying because The Secret History of the World turns into an international bestseller in terms of all the others who turned it down. Unless you're a much better person than me, there must have been a slight sense of satisfaction at that, no?
I knew when I kind of conceived of it, it goes against everything I'd learnt about what makes a book successful. And this book was sort of unlike anything else. It didn't fit into any category. While there obviously have been some very good histories of esoteric thought, there hasn't before been a history of the world according to esoteric thought. So it was different in that way.
Before we get to the book that you're just publishing now, which is, of course, is a much bigger book, but in some ways is a kind of twin, big brother or big sister of. How did you get from being Mark Booth publisher to writing this sort of sweeping history?
I think it was because as a child I'd had mystical experiences, and I was always trying to make sense of them and integrate that into consensual world, and then I studied philosophy and theology as part of the effort to make sense of it, and that really didn't work because English-speaking philosophy at that time was very analytical, very atheistic, and promulgated the view that only stupid people believe in religion and that religious language is strictly meaningless. At the same time, I found that kind of visionary gleam was kind of draining away. And so while I was a student, experimented with acid, and I found that did help bring back the visionary gleam in some way. It worked. And trying to find at what's sometimes called the higher teachings or the secret teachings or the esoteric teachings, and looking at the various traditions, it seemed to me that they were all saying pretty much the same thing. And I suppose that if something is a universal experience or universally held to be true, that doesn't prove it's true, but it does make it more likely. And so I had the idea of seeing what all these traditions had in common in terms of the history of the world, and I wove it all together into one narrative, including myths and stories which seem to resonate with one another. And I didn't try to prove any of it, which would have taken libraries of books, and it would have just been impossible. I just told it as a story, kind of letting philosophical ideas and spiritual ideas spin out of it. And I wanted to say, look, here is a completely different way of looking at the world and its history to set against the materialistic view that I think we've all been brought up in.
Yeah.
And to say, look, it's cogent, it hangs together. I think that lots of people read it and continue to read it because, it resonates with their experience.
It reflects our experience more than a lot of, say, materialistic views do. Setting aside what's right factually, what's right, what's wrong, if I sort of sit down in Scotland and look out across the sea and the sun is setting, you have an emotional response to that. And yet it's not the sun setting, it's the earth spinning and it's a ball of gas and
Yeah.
So you might know the facts of it, as it were, but you have an emotional response to it, which is what our experience is, isn't it, a lot of the time?
Yeah, I think it is. I think we have experiences all the time that we've either been conditioned to screen out or we've been conditioned not to understand the philosophical implications. So that if, for example, we meet someone and we fall in love and we believe this is meant to be, we often feel that in a very powerful way. You are deluding yourself if materialism is right. I think we all commonly read minds. I think if I had an esoteric superpower, it would be that. I find myself often screening out other people's minds. I think we all have premonitions, and we may recognize them. We all experience synchronicities when it seems that the cosmos is trying to tell us something.
Right.
And none of these things can be true if materialism is right.
You mentioned that when you were a child, you had some mystical experiences. Maybe you could just tell us about one of them, which was the kind of root of your impulse towards this kind of work.
I'll just describe two very briefly. One is I was sitting in my bedroom in suburban Ipswich, and suddenly I felt that I was filled with light and information. and I had a kind of school exercise book there, and I raced to scribble down all the images and messages I was downloading. The other one is that I was lying in bed and a kind of metallic head appeared hovering above me, and it was making a sort of metallic tinkling sound. And I said the Lord's Prayer and it vanished.
What was that feel like?
Well, it was frightening. I wasn't saying that from the point of view of being a kind of church-going Christian. I was saying I was just reaching out for a defense I knew, I suppose.
Have you made any meaning of those experiences in the years since? I can tell that they're still vivid, the way you describe them.
Well, yes. I mean, I think they fit in with two themes of my work. One is I think science has significantly moved the dial on how likely it is that there is non-human intelligence in the universe, and that the universe itself is intelligent. There may well be other non-biological forms of intelligence around us all the time, that we don't have the language, the words, the mathematics, the visual language to discern or understand them.
When I was a kid, you just reminded me, I mean, I was lying on my bed, I was very close to the wall. There was a pattern on the wall. I became sort of acutely aware that I was conscious. I must have been about 6 or 7. And then this phrase started going through my head. Now is now and it always will be now.
Yeah, wow, wonderful.
I occasionally try and recapture it by staring at a wall and saying it to myself, but never with the same power. We're going to talk about the new book, but I just wanted to say also, in terms of Secret History of the World, your intuition about it. So it does speak to the fact that this resonates with people. Behind the outward narrative of kings, wars, and empires, there's a hidden history preserved in the esoteric traditions of, ancient Egypt, Greece, Judaism, Christianity, etc. But this time, 20 years later, you're publishing The Secret History of the Universe. I mean, that's a big step up. I mean, it's not a history of science, right, Mark? It does sort of argue that the greatest scientific revolution of the 20th century was not just the discovery of relativity or quantum mechanics, but this sort of collapse of the materialistic worldview that had been with us since Isaac Newton. So just to sort of set the ground out, say a little bit about that, and also what materialism is versus idealism, and what had happened when Newton, rose to ascendancy.
The materialistic view of the universe is one that says that physical objects are the yardstick of what is real, and Newton was part of the formulation of the objective method. And the objective method, Newton and his friends realized that if you try to look at the world as objectively as possible, that is to focus on those objects and discard all your subjective biases and preconceptions, get rid of all subjectivity. If you do that, then you can come up with some remarkable results. And of course, that objective approach to science completely transformed the world in the Industrial Revolution and made human lives much safer, healthier, gave us more leisure time. And only a complete idiot would say that was a bad thing, but it came with a cost. And I think the cost was the devaluing of subjective experience. But the economist Maynard Keynes discovered Newton's occult and alchemical writings. He described Newton as the last of the magicians. I think he was wrong, because many of the great physicists of the 20th century were magicians in the same sense.
Blake's vision of Newton was this materialist. He's kind of ruined everything in a way. He's this boring secular guy. But in fact, he wasn't like that, was he? I mean, this is the point you make, is that he was an alchemist himself, right?
Yes.
He was a magician, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it would have been impossible for him to conceive of materialism as we have it today. It wasn't just that. It wasn't that well worked out then. But yeah, I mean, Newton believed that that the universe was created by this infinitely intelligent being, and that as we grew more intelligent, as extremely intelligent individuals like himself turned up, then we would begin to be able to decode it.
Right.
And that's what he thought he was doing.
So he didn't see himself as like abandoning, what we might call idealism, or the belief that consciousness and intelligence is behind it all. He saw it, this is just another expression of that.
Yes. Now, the opposite of materialism is idealism, not in the sense of believing in high ideals, but in the sense of believing that ideas rather than physical objects are the yardstick of what is real. And it may be quite hard for us who have been brought up in the kind of English-speaking education system and in this worldview, it's quite hard for us perhaps to try to understand why anyone ever believed in idealism. It just seemed completely implausible. But it is what all of humanity has believed in throughout history, up until the invention of the objective method of materialism. And I think it's beginning to drain away now. So I think it will probably turn out to be a little blip. And another way to look at it is that in the materialistic understanding of the universe, mind and consciousness are a very small island in the middle of a huge sea of matter. Consciousness only exists on a planet like Earth. There may be other planets out there, but basically it's a very small island. In idealism, it's completely the other way around. That the material universe is a small temporary island in a vast ocean of mind.
So you have this basic question, right? So what comes first, mind or matter, right? So
yes, yeah.
For millennia, possibly even for hundreds of millennia, we understood that mind comes first. Now, mind could mean God, could mean consciousness.
Yes.
And so all those traditions, Plato, Buddhism, Christianity, Kabbalah, the Hermetic philosophy, they all believe that reality starts with consciousness, intelligence, mind, right? And matter secondary, right? It's a manifestation of something underneath. Newton comes along, and from that time, the whole thing's flipped on its head. It's that, no, it's all just matter, and somehow from matter comes this thing we call consciousness, for instance, and the human imagination and creativity and stuff like that. We haven't worked out what consciousness is at all, but we assume that one day, with enough experiments, with enough testing, that we will understand how matter, physical cells and chemistry produces consciousness. That's the kind of materialistic view, right?
Yeah.
And then what you say is that, we've had these huge benefits from adopting that model without any doubt, absolutely, Industrial Revolution, medicine, the atom bomb, that's an advantage, I don't know, but we've sort of benefited materially from all these things. But in terms of mind, we haven't. And in fact, what has been happening more recently is that whole materialistic view has been overturned. But I was very intrigued by what you said about Newton, because, he was holding both these two views at the same time.
Yeah, well, I think he, was quite rightly very excited by the implications of the objective method he was helping to forge. And if we now turn to physicists in the 20th century, as technology enabled them to look into things at a smaller and smaller level, they began to discover that the world of solid objects, the world we perceive with our senses, is in some senses an illusion, as religion had always said. And they discovered that, we see the table in front of us as solid when it's really not solid at all. The nucleus, which is, you might say, is the solid part of an atom, is proportionately like a pea in the middle of a football stadium. And when we smash our hand against that table, that sense of impact is not atoms knocking into one another like billiard balls. It's electric fields repulsing. As the technology developed and they were able to see at smaller and smaller levels, they began to see things which would count as supernatural if they happened in the realm of human affairs. So you would have objects popping in and out of existence, which kind of raises the question of where they come from. You would have a particle passing through a solid object and come out the other side like a ghost going through a wall. Or you would have two particles separated by some distance coordinating their behavior, even though there was no kind of evident causal connection. Well, they found that you could change the behavior of a particle just by looking at it in a way which in other contexts would be called psychokinesis. They realized early on, and this is people like Max Planck and Niels Bohr and Heisenberg and Schrödinger, they realized that you couldn't apply the old materialistic, mechanistic models of thought to explain these. And that is why they all turned to other ways of thinking about it.
So some of the people who were held up as being products, possibly even cheerleaders for materialism, biographers tend to leave out some of their mystical leanings, some of their mystical interests. This is, in a sense, the secret history of it, because even before this generation, it has to be said, that people like Freud and Jung, who were kind of medics, basically, but were already talking about human consciousness and the subconscious, the unconscious, in a way which defied the sort of completely materialistic interpretation of things. One other thing that's good about the book is that you tell it through the stories of individuals as well. Maybe their secret life, it wasn't secret to them, but in terms of their biographers and how they portrayed, it was kind of hidden, because it didn't fit with this model, didn't fit with this idea that it's just about physics, in the age of materialism, the age of the particle, that we've actually overturned all those kind of obscure, obsolete, wacky ideas about gods and goddesses and spirits and all that sort of stuff, right? So maybe it wasn't a surprise for you, but it's a bit surprising perhaps that some of those figures that we assumed were, hard-boiled scientists actually were also interested in mysticism.
Yeah, well, no, it was a surprise to me. I mean, when after The Secret History of the World was published, various people from different walks of life got in touch, including scientists. I was very surprised to discover that many of them were very interested in these mystical ideas. And I know a couple who are practicing occultists.
Right.
Part of the problem is that we have been brought up with a materialistic worldview which comes with Anglo-American philosophy, which is analytical and materialistic and atheistic. The great scientists of the 20th century were mostly German or Hungarian, Italian, and they came from a very different tradition. The roots of Anglo-American philosophy lie in episodes like an apple falling on Newton's head, or Francis Bacon stuffing a chicken with ice to see if it would preserve it. German philosophy is all idealism. And Hegel, who is perhaps the greatest German philosopher of idealism, said that their tradition started with the mystic Jacob Boehme having a mystical experience. He was sitting at a table in his kitchen. He was looking at a pewter bowl, and suddenly it opened up and he saw the whole cosmos in it. So that leads to two very different worldviews. And I think that in the English-speaking world, we consistently fail to understand people like Einstein and Niels Bohr and Heisenberg and Schrödinger because of the philosophy we've been brought up to believe in. And the other thing is that those guys were all very broadly educated people. They were literate in philosophy and the history of religion and art and literature. And when you get to the 1960s, the leading physicist of the day was Richard Feynman, and he described philosophy as goofy.
Right.
They said, well, look, science has almost explained everything now. We're on the brink. So
yeah, we've got a theory of everything.
Yeah, obviously we don't need religion anymore. And philosophy you can stand down too, because physics answers all the important questions in philosophy, and the other questions are not worth asking.
A couple of years ago, I interviewed Simon Critchley. He'd just published that book, The Return of the Mystic. Simon's a philosopher in New York, and he said that he had to sort of creep out from behind the sofa, as it were, because he'd been schooled in rational philosophy, but he'd started to value and also to become interested in mysticism. But he said it was, he had to kind of keep his head down because the philosophers around him were sort of appalled, I think is the word he used, that he would even be sort of interested or suggesting such a thing, right? You mentioned the German philosopher who had the mystical experience, but that's sort of resonant of Blake again, isn't it?
Yeah, Jacob Boehme and William Blake are very similar figures, I think.
A world in a grain of sand and infinity in an hour.
Yeah.
From that tradition, from this European tradition almost, you're having these scientists who, they're sort of dismantling, not necessarily what Newton had said, because obviously, like as you said, it'd be dumb to reject that, but the assumptions that came from that actually science can solve and understand everything. And then, of course, as you said, matter turns out not to be solid. Particles are acting like waves. Observing the experiment seems to change it. Are these particles, are they influencing each other over enormous distances? Time, our understanding of time's kind of become very bent, hasn't it? Space itself is becoming stranger. So reality itself is being interpreted in a different way, and so they have to turn to much older ideas and models to try and describe what they're finding.
Yes, exactly. That puts it very well. And then if you fast forward to the Second World War, and it's not going well, and Heisenberg and Lise Meitner were on their way to making the atom bomb. Einstein and some of the others who had fled knew what was going on, and they went to the American president and said, "Look, you've got to do this first, because if you don't, if the Germans get it first, all is lost." And that is what led to the Manhattan Project, and
Right.
what they were doing really was they were looking at these supernatural phenomena in the quantum realm, these powers, and they were trying to find ways to amplify them and to draw them up into the realm of human affairs. And a bit like, a magician in a Lovecraft story. And that is essentially what happened. And so humankind, because of this, arrived at a crossroads. This brilliant new science had unleashed these powers, and humanity has to decide whether it's going to use it for good or evil.
Right.
And of course, the first fruit, the first flowering, was Hiroshima. Because that was so awful, I think that may have contributed to the move to stop, by Feynman and others, to try to stop thinking about the wider implications because they were so awful.
By putting these discoveries into this kind of very long perspective of human consciousness, then what they've actually kind of potentially unleashed has got much more terrifying implication, right?
Yes, fast forward to today, and we have the same thing with AI.
Right.
You can see the history of modern science starting in the early 20th century up to the beginning of the present century. It was a quest to try to find what is fundamental, what is irreducible, what are the building blocks of the universe. And at first, they thought it was the atom, and then they thought it was the thing inside the atom, and then they thought it was fields, because it looked as if particles were nothing more than vibrations in a field. That's what string theory is, of course. And then finally, they decided that what is irreducible is nothing which is in any sense material. What drives the universe, what forms the universe and informs it, is something like a very complex, evolving system of algorithms, logic propositions.
So you describe this third age as the age of information, right? And there's some things that you talk about that twisted my melon, like that information is underneath it all somehow. But what do we mean by that? I mean, because it sounds terribly possible, given where we are now. You talk a lot about what AI and the implications and what it might be, etc. But what is it then, this information that underpins reality?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think one way into it is to note that humanity has always understood the universe on the model of the most advanced technology of the time. So in the age of the Enlightenment, people understood the universe as running smoothly like a clock. And in the industrial age, it saw the universe as being a mechanistic machine like a steam engine. Today, it's a computer. And so this evolving system of logic, this leads physicists and computer scientists today to assert that the universe is like a computer. And if that is the case, then the universe either is something intelligent or has something intelligent operating it. And, obviously it's a very popular idea in culture, from Philip K. Dick and The Matrix, and to Elon Musk saying we are 99.9% likely to live in a computer simulation. But many very serious scientists believe that true. They believe that the nature of the universe is essentially holographic. And you say, what is it? Well, I suppose that some people and some traditions would say that is God, or cosmic consciousness, or being. I think we can't get very close to describing it. I think we can say it's in some ways like our intelligence, in other ways not. It's in some ways like computer intelligence, in other ways not. But it's far superior, far higher than the other forms we know about.
The discoveries, or the kind of new ways of thinking that have come about sort of generationally, one after another, even the actual dismantling of the sort of ultra-materialistic view, doesn't actually prove religion, but that it removes many of the reasons for dismissing, spiritual ideas out of hand. And even this latest model, this latest way of understanding it, whether we fall back and sort of say, well, we can't really describe what it is underneath reality, but we could call it God. I mean, obviously lots of religious people would jump on that and say, yeah, there we go, we told you all along. Might it be, Mark, that just as we've gone from the kind of clockwork universe, the steam engine, through the atom, through the field, through this idea of information underneath it all, that this is going to get replaced by some other more sophisticated, more subtle model at some point?
Oh, I think it will. I think we'll keep on getting closer to describing it. I don't suppose we ever will. I think that the mathematics we try to use in physics to describe the universe now is in some sense arbitrary, and in some senses it may get us very close, but it's not exact. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it's very important for this story that I try and tell in the book, that many of these physicists had mystical experiences.
Right.
So this was something propelling them to explore these ideas. And something that many of them describe is discovering in the universe of mathematics an intriguing, new, very complex pattern. And then the next step is that they describe finding this very same pattern in nature. And this pattern then helps them to understand the universe in a brilliant new way, and sometimes gives rise to extraordinary new technologies. Now, they all seem to say that when they discern this beautiful new pattern, it's not that they gradually put it together and construct it. It comes to them fully formed. And Roger Penrose, who is, one of the 3 or 4 greatest living physicists, he describes coming across a pattern like this. He compares it to an explorer finding a new range of mountains that no one has ever seen before. So it existed long before its discovery by him or his peers. It probably existed before the physical universe. It's probably, in some sense, eternal.
This is a sidebar about quantum physics and Buddhism. To take up Mark's theme, we usually imagine the world as being made up of separate things. There is a tree, a rock, a person, a planet. Each thing seems to exist by itself with its own properties. And we imagine that underneath everything, there must be more tiny pieces of solid matter, little building blocks that are ultimately independent. But quantum physics doesn't really fit with that picture. And this is where some interesting parallels appear with such traditions as Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. These religions didn't discover quantum physics. They developed thousands of years before modern physics using meditation, philosophy and observation of human experience rather than experiments with subatomic particles. But the similarities are intriguing. And one of the central ideas in Buddhism is dependent origination, that says that things don't exist independently. Everything arises because of conditions. A tree isn't just a tree. It depends on sunlight, water, soil, air, insects, other plants, climate, countless other things. Remove enough of those conditions and the tree no longer exists. The same is true of ourselves. We think of ourselves as separate, permanent me's. Buddhism says our bodies, memories, personalities, thoughts and feelings are constantly changing. We depend upon other people and the world around us. So where is this permanent, separate self, this me? Quantum physics gives a sort of scientific reason for questioning the idea of completely separate things too. Particles can become entangled. Two quantum particles can behave as parts of a single system, even when they're separated by a great distance. Buddhism didn't predict entanglement, but there is an interesting philosophical echo. Reality does not consist of independent objects. Relationships and interactions are fundamental. There's another interesting connection with Buddhism. We normally think, I'm here, the universe is out there. But what if that division isn't as fundamental as it appears? Quantum physics raises a similar interesting question about the relationship between the observer and the observed. At the quantum level, measuring something isn't simply like looking at it from a distance. The measurement involves an interaction with the thing being measured, which changes it. Quantum physics doesn't say that human consciousness creates reality. Well, not yet. And the word observer in quantum physics doesn't necessarily mean a person. It could be a device, an atom, a photon, the surrounding environment. But the question that's raised is profound. Can we really understand reality by imagining ourselves as completely separate observers looking at a completely independent world? So what does all this mean? Probably not that Buddhists secretly understood quantum mechanics. But there is a possibility that different ways of investigating reality can lead to some of the same answers. Different questions, different methods, but sometimes arriving at a similar position. Reality may not quite be as simple, separate and solid as it appears. And perhaps that's where science and mysticism become interesting companions. Science says, don't assume reality is what it appears to be, test it. Some of these traditions say, don't assume your experience of reality is reality. Look more closely.
There's another way of looking at it, which is a bit on the weird side, which is that ancient religions, such as the Greeks, they believed their gods contained significant numerical values. So it may be that Greek myths have another layer of meaning which is to do with mathematical formulae. And it may be that if we could decode them, Greek myths are an account of the physics of the universe as the Greeks understood it. Some significant work has been done on that.
That's a wonderful thought, isn't it? Particularly with the Greek myths, what's quite interesting there is that through Freud and then through Jung, they took the Greek mythology as being psychologically significant and psychologically symbolic and psychologically important now. We use those phrases psyche, and Narcissus, don't we? We use them in everyday language even now, right? And so that they point to some fundamental truths or something, right?
I think it is certainly true that the great myths have many, many different layers of meaning. Being prompted by that thought about the ancient Greeks, it may be that when a new complex pattern which animates both the mathematical universe and the physical universe comes to somebody like Roger Penrose, it may be that what is happening is something like a thought being swimming through his mental space. And at that point, his job is to try to throw a net over it.
Right. That's the notion of an idea as an entity.
as being more real than physical objects, but also in some sense being alive and intelligent. And that does sound a bit weird to us, but I think that's only because we've been conditioned to believe in materialism, and we find it very difficult to climb out of that. One of the effects of materialism, being born into a physical body, is that we probably have a very limited, primitive ideas about identity, and it may well be that some or all of the thoughts we pride ourselves on having originated are thought beings swimming through our mental space.
We know that we can only perceive certain wavelengths, don't we? That there's lots of wavelengths beyond our sort of range of vision and hearing and stuff. So the reality itself, even as the way we see it, is extremely limited. And I guess panpsychism and, ways of thinking like that, almost like polytheism, would see the universe as populated by spirits, intelligences, entities, however you want to describe them. That kind of very rich view of things. There's something quite specific that you tell about the lives of certain scientists, that their personal kind of crises, some of these mystical experiences that they were having, mental illness even, right? Rivalries and kind of moral dilemmas are also part of the story, and that creativity and genius and altered states of consciousness often accompanied, as you're just saying, actually, these scientific breakthroughs, whether you get the image of the benzene ring in a dream or the structure of DNA, and it might be to do with a psychedelic experience. You referred to your own acid experiences, and how they may have prompted and pushed you in this direction. And I suppose, to bring this stuff down specifically to certain countercultural themes like psychedelics, for instance, the notion of entities and, ideas having their own agency doesn't seem so strange.
I think that's exactly right. It's a help in understanding these scientific ideas because, our form of consciousness has evolved in the way it has because it is useful, not because it gives us a true picture of the universe. And there are, esoteric traditions which would say we had to be immersed in matter, we had to fall into physical bodies, we had to go into this age of extreme materialism in the late 19th century, early 20th century, in order to help us evolve certain faculties which we wouldn't otherwise have.
Right.
Esoteric philosophy would say that we have to be in this physical body because it has a function which is to screen out spiritual influences, to make us less aware of the great thought beings. If we knew every moment of the day what God's loving will for us is, we would never develop free will. We would just do it. The extreme materialism of the 19th and 20th century probably helped us to grow a capacity for conceptual thought, which may not exist anywhere else in the universe. If you read accounts of angelic wisdom or angelic vision, such as you find in the book of Revelations, it's all symbolic. Angels, if they exist, may not have a capacity to think in a conceptual way. So both in terms of free will and abstract conceptual thinking, we may be at the growing tip of the universe.
That's a positive thought. You mentioned that some scientists who are now occult practitioners, and let's make this personal. And maybe you can talk a little bit about your own beliefs and, in a sense, what to do with it. Because if reading this history of the universe, this history of science, seen through the lenses that you've described, we start to accept the mystic, the mystery, and has always been there, whether it's been secret or occult or hidden or a lost culture. What do you do about it? I mean, you write about it, actually, and that's, of course, opening the door for discussions like this and for thinking in a different way and stuff. But is there a way that we can respond to it?
Yeah, I think so, yes. I grew up in the Church of England, which is, pretty much the same as having no religion at all. Because, it doesn't really assert anything about the world. It seemed very boring, actually. Going to church was very boring as a child and as a teenager. So my hope is that if these ideas can be expressed in the language of science in some way, then it might seem more interesting, even exciting. Studying this material has helped me towards a more spiritual approach to life. I do have spiritual practices. I don't practice magic. People disapprove of magic for two reasons. I think people like Richard Dawkins disprove it because they think it doesn't work. And then people in the church disapprove of it because they think it does. And I'm in that level. I know people who practice it. I wouldn't practice it myself. I think it would be a temptation for me. I think spiritual evolution always brings temptations with it. You know, if you look at the history of the church or gurus, you will see that high spiritual evolution and authority brings with it temptations many, many people cannot resist.
In terms of, say, a cult leader, sex, power, material gain, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know a guru has slept with a lot of his attractive younger followers, and I think he would justify that to himself by saying, well, that's all right as long as I didn't get attached to them.
Yeah, that's been a tradition, hasn't it?
So some ancient esoteric traditions, there was the idea that you shouldn't evolve spiritual powers any faster than you evolve morally. And I wonder if that to some extent has been lost.
Right.
I think that as a species, we're facing that dilemma now with AI. I mean, I think it will soon be the case that, in the same way that people can now build drones in their garage or their shed, very soon people will be able to build very powerful AIs in that way.
That's a very interesting way to see it. Don't let your spiritual evolution outrun your moral evolution, and to apply that to AI too. On the subject of magic, by the way, just talking to somebody like Alan Moore, the author, Alan's view on magic is very interesting. His way of practicing it is, I don't think it's dangerous, actually. I mean, he's got quite a sophisticated view of what magic actually means, and for him, it's very much to do with creativity. It might be to do with performing certain actions which you find meaningful. And it's operating, you could say, at an unconscious level. So if I go to a stone circle and make a bouquet of flowers and hang it around a stone, what does it mean? I mean, well, you could say it doesn't mean anything, but actually the act itself, which feels like a magical act, has some meaning which is pre-rational. It's not to do with thinking, is it? In that sense, it's a practice in a way that prayer is. Prayer might feel actually very meaningful. Obviously, it is very meaningful for a lot of people. However, you could sort of say it doesn't work. People pray that they're not going to get cancer. They do get cancer. They pray that their kid's not going to die. The kid does die, But at the same time, the actual act itself is meaningful, isn't it? At one level, those kind of magical practices have got a value which has nothing to do with even them working or not.
I don't think what you're doing is necessarily sort of pre-rational or irrational. I think it may be to do with a higher rationality.
Right.
So if you are walking through a forest or a wood, very narrow, egotistical idea of our own intelligence and its locality, of it being in our heads, we fail to see that there is an equal intelligence going on all around us in the workings of the forest. There's quite as much intelligent information processing going on in the roots, the trunks, the leaves, the flowers, the animals. It's just not local like ours.
Right.
And so when we are walking in the forest, if we're open to it, we may be reconnecting our intelligence with the intelligence in nature.
Right.
I suppose a romantic poet might describe that as being an irrational experience. But in another way, it's a very rational one, I think.
I mean, certainly for Alan, the magic with a K, as it were, is recognising the correspondences and synchronicity between things. So, in other words, you're making a gesture towards the fact that everything is interrelated.
Yes. If our intelligence is a little local extrusion of the universal intelligence, then we are all connected to one another and to everything in a direct way we generally fail to recognize. And if you are aware of that interconnectivity and of being a part of the whole, then you're less likely to do things which lead to the annihilation of the species.
Right. Mark, you've written A Secret History of the Universe. Where'd you go from there?
I don't know. I'm still really fascinated by these ideas, and I'm looking forward to these sorts of discussions and refining them. I kind of don't see myself as a writer with a capital W, because I know from having worked in publishing that is a kind of snare for people and leads to a kind of damaging kind of egotism. And I only really write a book when I feel I've got something new to say, and maybe if I'm lucky in a few years, something new will come to me, fully formed, so I don't have to put it together.
Mark Booth, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you, Stephen. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks to Mark, or Jonathan. I'll put a link to his works and his terrific Substack in the show notes. That's really worth checking out. Terrific reads full of amazing stories, characters and ideas. Some of what we talked went deep with me. I've just come back from a retreat in the Trossachs, that's a mountain range in Scotland. It's extraordinarily beautiful there, and we're sheltering from the horrendous heat of the south. I had an extraordinary experience of nature. Not observing nature, but of actually being nature. And for me, that was a revelation. I'm guessing I'm behind a lot of you on that. I definitely need to spend more time in the wilderness. But if you want to spend more time with us, come encourage us at bureauoflostculture.com. Thanks for listening. Let's keep listening. I'll see you down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides for more tales from the other side.